Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to this week's Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions. And also, as always, if I don't answer your question in this video, then please go ahead and copy and paste it onto the bottom of this Patreon post. And also, please don't forget to like all the questions that you want answered, because I generally answer them in order of how many likes they have. So let's jump right in. Anonymous Shadow 121 asks, is it better to read fast and get used to reading quickly, or better to read slowly, comprehending as much as you can? I feel like it's not possible to get 100% comprehension when you're a beginner at reading, so reading slowly and skipping words you do not know might help. But that will really take away from the comprehension. What do you think is a better way to improve one's reading ability as a beginner? What do you think is the better way to improve one's reading ability as a beginner as well as a more intermediate reader? So I think there's two things that you got to separate. One of them is the actual speed at which you're just reading. And then the other thing is how quickly you are to give up on something that's not clicking and kind of just skipping it and moving on to the next thing. And so for that first category of just in general, how fast are you reading? Like, let's say there's 5 sentences in a row where you can read them no problem. How quickly are you reading those 5 sentences? I would say you probably want to err on the slow side, because in general, the way that I think about it is that you can force yourself to try to read quickly and kind of artificially build up the ability to read at a pretty good speed in a foreign language. But by doing this, you might be kind of implicitly building habits of skipping over little words that aren't strictly necessary for getting the overall meaning, but you don't want to get into the habit of just skipping over. So one example might be articles in English, right? If you ignored all the little A's and thes that are in front of words, like instead of saying like, I went to the store, you just processed it as I went to store, and your brain kind of subconsciously ignored the, you would still be able to get the overall meaning of what was being said. But the problem is, if you get in the habit of kind of subconsciously ignoring all the articles when reading English, assuming that you're a learner of English, then you might not properly acquire the usage of those words. And then when you go on to output yourself, you might use them improperly. And I think maybe this happens to a lot of Chinese speakers who learn English, and they have a really hard time with these articles and things like that. So basically, if you force yourself to read quickly at the beginning, I think you might build habits of subconsciously ignoring things that aren't strictly necessary for getting the overall meaning, but you don't want to be ignoring because you need to acquire the usage of those little components, whatever they are, in order to produce the language in a native-like way. And on the other hand, I think just by, going at not a snail's pace, but, really taking in each word as you go is going to enable you to, understand more and probably deepen your comprehension. It's kind of like a tortoise versus the hare thing. If you're you read less sentences total, but you take away more from each sentence, that might actually be more beneficial than if you just kind of are skimming through and you're not fully processing anything. And so even though you might have had your eyes pass over many sentences, you're not really reading them deeply, and so you're not taking as much away. Now, of course, if you try to go too slowly, then it's going to get really tedious and boring, and that's not going to be good either. So ultimately, I think you want to aim for just a comfortable pace. And what I found is that when I was reading Japanese, I'm always kind of put the emphasis on comprehension, and I didn't worry too much about my reading speed. And what happened was, over time, my reading speed naturally got better. And I've talked about this in previous Q&As, but basically a lot of what true reading speed is, like when you can read quickly without subconsciously skipping anything, that's because your brain, as it gets more fluent in a language, it learns how to chunk in bigger and bigger pieces. And so you might see 3 or 4 or 5 words in a row that your brain can instantly process as a single unit. And the ability to do that, to chunk things in big pieces, is how it's possible to truly read quickly in a kind of non-artificial way. And that ability just comes naturally as you get more comfortable with the language. So that's why overall I would say read at whatever pace feels most comfortable for you. Don't artificially force yourself to try to read more quickly, and the speed will come naturally as you gain comfort in the language. And after you're completely fluent and you have no trouble understanding anything, if you still feel like your reading speed's not where it's at, then maybe you want to start forcing yourself to try to read a little more quickly. But that's something that I would do after you're fluent in reading, not something that I would do when you're still just struggling to understand what sentences and paragraphs mean. Now, that was that first category that I said of just your general reading speed, but then this whole other thing you have to think about is when you get stumped on something, how much time should you spend racking your brain on it before you just skip it and move on? And this, I would say, like, you want to move on pretty quickly. So I don't really want to put a specific amount in terms of like how many seconds, because in my mind, when I'm stuck on a sentence, if I was going to think like, oh, I only have 10 seconds to figure it out and then I have to move on, that would like just create more anxiety and it wouldn't be helpful. But so I think it's best to just think of it as, if you are reading a sentence or you read a sentence and it doesn't immediately click and you get stuck, spend a few moments kind of thinking it over, trying to piece together the pieces in your head and solve it like a puzzle, maybe look something up. And if after a few moments it doesn't click, then you want to move on. You don't want to be spending an excessive amount of time on something that's not clicking, because if it's not clicking after a couple moments, that means that it's not I+1, it's not within reach, and so it's just not going to be a good use of time to try to just spend minutes thinking about it or looking it up or asking a speaker about it. It's best to just leave it and move on, because the things that are truly I+1 that are going to grow your ability are going to click either instantly or after just a couple moments. So I would say in general, you want to read not necessarily slowly, but at a comfortable pace, but you want to be moving on or skipping things that you get stumped on relatively quickly after just a few moments. So Zach asks, hey Matt, what were some hobbies you gave up or spent significantly less time on when you picked up Japanese? Did you ever struggle to balance learning Japanese with your other hobbies? Yeah, so basically the way that I lived my life since really like late elementary school, early middle school, was that I would have, actually scratch that, even since before that, even since like the beginning of elementary school, I would always have one thing that I was really obsessed with, and for the duration of time that I was engaging in that activity, I pretty much would not be interested in anything else, which is kind of funny to think about in hindsight, because it does make it sound like I have had the right type of natural personality to get really good at one foreign language, which is probably true. But yeah, basically, even from elementary school, I would be either like really into Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, or Beyblades. And when I was into Yu-Gi-Oh, it was only Yu-Gi-Oh. I wanted to watch the show, and I wanted to collect the cards and duel my friends, and that was all I cared about. And then when I was into Pokemon, I was playing the Pokemon games and liked the Pokemon anime and would cosplay as Pokemon characters. And then same thing with Beyblade. It was very like, one thing at a time. And when I got a little older, then it became either, really, I think skateboarding was the first thing that I, as I don't know, someone who could, think about their position in the world a little bit more, that was the first thing where I was like, okay, skateboarding is cool. I want to get good at skateboarding. That was when I was in 7th grade. And so I pretty much got full into skateboarding. All my friends were other people who were really into skateboarding. When I was sitting in school, I would have a little tech deck, which is like this little mini skateboard just for your fingers. I'd be playing with that all day. And then right after school, we'd go to the skate park. And then when we would come home at the end of the day from the skate park, then we'd watch skate videos on YouTube or on the TV. And that was all I would think about. And then I also got into lacrosse for a period of time. And then I also got into pen spinning. Now, pen spinning, I've talked about in the past. It's a funny thing because you might not think of it as something that you could really get into at a very serious level, but I totally did. There's this whole community of people online who are very into pen spinning. There's pen spinning tournaments and competitions that are conducted online, but yeah, there's a whole culture around it about what pens you use and modifying custom pens, and there were what were called mods, which were modifications to pens, which were basically people would take 3 or 4 or 5 pens and then take different parts from each pen and combine them together into like this baton-like thing that was really good for pen spinning because it was perfectly balanced and weighted and all these things. And so there were famous mods that famous pen spinners would have, and in order to replicate these mods, I would have to order pens from Japan and from other places in the world in order to get the exact mod. And there were secret mods where someone would make a new mod and they'd show it off in a video, but they wouldn't know how to use it. And so one time I became friends with a famous pen spinner, and he told me his secret mod, and I felt like I was the coolest person in the world because I knew how to make the Baron mod, but no one else did. And it was different than what you'd think. And so, yeah, and also there were even people near me who also were into pen spinning, and we would meet up in person, and we became friends through pen spinning. And there's like so much to it. It actually has a lot in common with skateboarding in that it's a mix between being like a technical type of like skill-based thing and also a very like artsy kind of creative thing where learning all the various tricks that are possible and mastering them to the point where you can make them look good and look effortless and look smooth is a very much a technical thing that requires many hours of just practicing the same thing over and over and over like an instrument. But then there's other component of it where you combine tricks into combos and you come up with new tricks and new linkages between tricks, and that would require a lot of creativity. I know I just said that music was a good example of a technical thing. Obviously, music is a very creative thing as well, so it's similar to music in that way. And so, yeah, it was really fun, really engaging, and I got really into it, and I pretty much was totally consumed by it for about 2 years. And I think one of the things I really liked about pen spinning is that although there was a pretty, decent worldwide community that was into pen spinning, compared to something like, I don't know, lacrosse or skateboarding, the population of pen spinners was very small, which made me feel like if I really pursued this thing, then I would really have a shot at becoming the best, like the best in the world. And that was what I really wanted. I was kind of like the main character from, what's that movie with the drummer? Whiplash. Yeah, I was kind of like that character from Whiplash, where I had this really kind of like fragile ego, and I just wanted to be the best at something. And with skateboarding in particular, I ran up into this issue where fear was holding me back. Where, to do cool skateboarding tricks, you have to jump down like flights of stairs and like jump onto handrails and basically do pretty dangerous stunts. And I got to the point where there were stunts or tricks that I knew that I was capable of doing and maybe I had even done in the past, but I just couldn't get my body to do it because I was just gripped by this visceral fear. And I could slowly overcome my fear over time by just, trying to do it over and over. Like I would, if I was, for example, going to do a trick down a stair set, I would, run up to the stair set and then stop a bunch of times. And then I would jump down the stair set, but then kick my skateboard out and land on my feet. Do that a couple times and then slowly work up to it. And I was able to slowly conquer my fear, but it was a very slow, tedious process. And there were people around me who just didn't seem to experience this fear response. So there were people, and a lot of times these people were on the less intelligent side, they would be able to just throw their bodies down giant flights of stairs and commit to tricks as if it was nothing. And they just didn't experience this fear, at least not nearly to the degree that I was. So even though I saw that I could slowly conquer my fear over time in an incremental way, I still was always going to be at this huge disadvantage compared to other people that just didn't have that fear response. And this made me sort to not like skateboarding because it just felt like this stupid emotion was holding me back from actualizing my full potential. Now, it's interesting to think back in hindsight because now I have experienced meditation a lot more, and I realize there are certain tools and practices that you can do specifically to work on fear, but I didn't know about that at the time, and it just felt like this completely unstoppable like burden or like wall that I just couldn't overcome. And I did enjoy skateboarding just for the fun of skateboarding, but there was also a component of it where my ego was at stake. I had to be like a good skateboarder for how long I had been skateboarding. And I was always comparing myself to like, okay, I've been skating for 2 years. How long has this guy been skating for? Oh, he's been skating for longer than me, then I'm better than him. Cool. Oh, what? This other guy's better than me and he's been skating for less time? Like, what's up with that? I need to work harder. So again, I had this kind of fragile ego, and everything in my life that I was doing was pretty much about trying to overcome this deep inferiority complex. And because of that, skateboarding just started to feel like it wasn't going to be a good outlet for my time and energy because this fear thing was holding me back. So that's why I think I really got into pen spinning, because although pen spinning is kind of this really lame, uncool thing, it still presented the potential for me to become world-class, truly world-class, and I really craved that. So I did that for 2 years, and it was a lot of fun. But then I started to, over time, start to feel more like pen spinning is such a lame thing that no one in my life thinks is cool besides other pen spinners, that I can't really afford, like on an egoic level, I can't afford to keep investing all my time and energy into it. And the biggest thing about pen spinning is that anyone who's not like deep into pen spinning can pretty much not tell the difference at all between someone who's been pen spinning for 6 months and the best pen spinner in the world. So I kind of was experiencing that no matter how much I improved at pen spinning, real life people who weren't also into pen spinning wouldn't notice at all. Like I was already infinitely good at pen spinning for from the perspective of the average person. And so all the work I was putting into pen spinning was only really about impressing other pen spinners, which is pretty rare, right? For there to be another pen spinner. Now, again, if I had been doing this from a more genuine place of pen spinning is my passion and I love it and I'm doing it just out of love, then that shouldn't have mattered at all. And there was a component of that for sure. And I still like really loved pen spinning, but there was this whole other component where I was doing it from a very egoic place, and it started just like how the skateboarding started to feel like it wasn't going to fulfill my ego's needs because that fear was going to hold me back from actualizing my potential. Pen spinning started to feel like it wasn't going to meet my ego's needs because no one cared about pen spinning. So even if I did become the best, from the perspective of most people, I would still be an average person who hadn't really accomplished anything meaningful. And this was when I started to get into Japanese more seriously. I first became interested in Japanese around the same time that I started pen spinning, when I was a freshman in high school. But now, for those first 2 years, I was just doing traditional learning and making virtually no progress. But then I discovered AJAT, and I studied abroad in Japan. Not studied abroad, sorry. I just went to Japan for like a couple weeks, like 2-3 weeks for the first time, and had this really amazing experience and bonded with my host family. And it was at that time when, I've told the story before, I showed my host family a video of Katsumoto, and they said that he's native level because Japanese people exaggerate, and I didn't know that. But anyway, it was at that moment that I decided, okay, from the second that I get home, I'm quitting pen spinning and I'm doing Japanese all the time. And so, yeah, I just decided to quit pen spinning pretty much altogether because I wanted to put all my time and energy towards Japanese. And this was a little sad and a little bit hard to give up because, at that point, most of my friends were people who I'd met through pen spinning, and it was this whole world, and I was leaving this whole world behind. But more than anything, I was just really excited and exhilarated to get started with Japanese. And that was such an exciting thing, like jumping into this whole world of all Japanese all the time and feeling like I was one of the rare few people who had discovered this method that was, infinitely more effective than the traditional methods. Basically, it made it pretty easy to cope with the sadness of letting go of pen spinning. And so, yeah, for the first while, like for the first year or two, I didn't really struggle at all because, well, I'd say for the first year, I didn't struggle at all to stay focused on Japanese because I was just so excited and so passionate about it. But I'd say from about a year in, there were other things that were starting to pull my interest. Like the first thing was that for whatever reason, I got into Game Boys around when I was 1 year into Japanese, or 1 year and a half. It was after I'd already come back from my 6-month study abroad. But I'd always liked Pokemon from the time that I was a kid, and I've always liked the aesthetic of a Game Boy. And so I kind of discovered that online there was this community of people who basically collect and modify Game Boys. And a lot of people would do it for the sake of creating music, because there was this whole chiptune scene of people who would use Game Boys or the original Nintendo system to create music. And I thought that was really cool because it was kind of this idea that sometimes when you impose a limitation externally, that actually allows for more creativity. So if you're going to say, I'm going to compose music, but the music has to come out of a single Game Boy, and there's only, 8 bits worth of sound, and there's only 4 channels or whatever, that makes it a lot more difficult. And so you have to get more creative to make a good song when you have all these limitations. And I thought that was really cool. Also, I just loved the sound of the music that came from the Game Boy because it was really nostalgic and reminded me of my childhood. And so, I started collecting Game Boys, and I wanted to make music myself, like make chiptune music myself. And I thought I was going to, and I kind of got some Game Boys, and basically for the modifications, like they will put in backlights into the original Game Boys and Game Boy Colors that don't have a backlight, and they'll like make it so that you can like they add in a second headphone jack that is like higher quality. I don't really remember how it works, but there are a bunch, and then also they just change the color of the buttons or like spray paint the outside to make it look cooler, and like change the color of the LED that tells you that the battery's on, and all these little things just for fun. And so I thought that was really cool, and I started collecting Game Boys, and I got like a Game Boy Color that and modded it to put a backlight in it. Like basically, you can take the original Game Boy Advanced SP and then take it apart and take the backlight out and put it into a Game Boy Color. And so I did that. That was pretty fun and cool. I had to learn how to solder to do it. And I got a Game Boy Light and a Game Boy Pocket and was messing around with that. And I tried to make music, but I basically realized that even though, in a sense, making music on a Game Boy is very limited because there's not that much that you can do with it, you still have to know how to make music. Like, with zero music knowledge, you can't just randomly input sounds and make a song. And so I realized that I would have to actually learn some real music theory in order to be able to make songs on a Game Boy. And at that point, I was like, well, I don't have enough time for this because I got to do Japanese. And also, just the whole Game Boy thing was, at one point, this was only probably for a couple months, but it was taking up a lot of time, and so I eventually just decided, nope, I got to focus on Japanese, and I can worry about this stuff. I can worry about music after I get fluent in Japanese. And for at this point in time, I really did think of the process of learning Japanese as something that had an end. Like, I was gonna reach some point of mastery. Maybe it would take another couple years, but after that, I would have Japanese down pat, and I could move on to the next things in my life. And this wasn't true. It turns out that language ability is a spectrum all the way down, and there's really no such thing as mastery in the sense of a single point that you can reach where you've just made it and you're done. But because I didn't understand that, and I had this kind of naive view of language ability, it really allowed me to put things on hold that I wanted to do but would have gotten in the way of learning Japanese, because it was like, well, it's just a couple more years till I'm done with Japanese, and then I can do those things. So learning how to play music, not only on the Game Boys, but also like I played bass too. That's another thing that I forgot to mention. And I always wanted to learn how to play guitar. I also played piano as a child, and so I wanted to learn how to play the piano better, and that's something I still want to do. I still want to learn how to play the guitar and the piano, that I haven't really got around to in the past couple years, but that was something that I wanted to do, but I was like, okay, I got to put that on hold to learn Japanese. And there were many other subjects that I wanted to study. Like, I think at a certain point I realized, oh, I'm really interested in philosophy and psychology, and I want to study these things. But studying them in Japanese didn't really seem feasible because it was really hard to find good resources. And also, at the beginning, I just wasn't really even good enough. Like, it was like watching anime and reading light novels was so much more efficient for improving my Japanese ability that I couldn't really justify trying to learn philosophy in Japanese because it would have been so efficient. Plus, the resources were really hard to find. So there started to be more subjects that I wanted to learn about, but I was putting on hold because I had to finish Japanese. And so, yeah, I wouldn't say that I struggled to balance Japanese with other hobbies, but I would say that I had to make sacrifices, and it was difficult to make those sacrifices, but ultimately, even though it was difficult, I never really struggled to make those sacrifices because it was just really clear in my mind that Japanese was my top priority. And it stayed that way for 5 years of doing AJAT. And then towards the end, it started to become, okay, maybe I want to learn Chinese too. And then I was struggling to balance Japanese and Chinese. But ultimately, as soon as Chinese started to really get in the way, I would realize that Japanese was more important to me, and I would drop it and go back to focusing on Japanese full time. And so, yeah, I guess, it was not effortless. There definitely were things that I had to sacrifice, but ultimately, because my priorities were so clear, I think I was able to do that without too much struggle, per se. Sorry, I went into a lot of, information about my life that's not really relevant to the question, but I'm assuming that you guys would want to hear that because the whole question is kind of about me personally, and it had a lot of upvotes. So, and there's always the timestamp, so people can always skip if they get bored of my answer. So, Katinka Wondergem asks, Hey Matt, you've talked about how you have a massive passive vocabulary in Japanese, and I was wondering how you might go about using that passive vocabulary to increase your active vocabulary, especially in speaking. I'm sometimes bothered by my lack of eloquence when speaking to friends in foreign languages I speak fluently or comfortably. While this isn't a problem when I output in the form of writing. Any thoughts would be great. So, I never really had this issue. In my experience, really I had the opposite issue. I would find that if I just spoke whatever words came to my mind naturally, I would end up using too many big words and I'd sound like I was trying to flex my vocabulary too hard, or I would even use words that native speakers either wouldn't know or they'd be so rare that they would get caught off guard and not really understand what I was saying. That I had to kind of censor myself and force myself to use less flowery language and more everyday language. And so I hear a lot of people expressing this issue of like, how do I expand my active vocabulary? But I think immersion is just the answer. Like, if you get a lot of immersion from high quality sources that were created by eloquent people, then I think your mind just absorbs those words and you learn how to use them naturally. Like, I find in English too, I sometimes use bigger words and things like that, but I never ever consciously think, oh, I'm going to use this big word. Let me try to fit this big word into a sentence today. And I've heard that sort of advice given for people who want to improve their active vocabulary, but I don't recommend that, because I think if you're playing this conscious game where you're like, okay, I want to have a bigger active vocabulary, let me pick out 10 big SAT words and use them in a sentence in the middle of a conversation today, then that really risks basically starting to speak unnaturally. Because if you don't fully acquire a word, and I think the acquisition process, it doesn't stop at understanding. It goes all the way until the point where you can effortlessly use a word yourself. So if you haven't fully acquired a word to the point where it just spontaneously pops into your head in the middle of a conversation at the perfect time, then trying to force yourself to use that word in spite of not having acquired it really runs the risk of saying something unnatural, because there's so much subtlety to the usages of words that I don't really think you can just consciously have a decent understanding of what it means and try to fake it. I think you got to wait till you acquire it in order to really be able to use it naturally. And so I would say just focus on the input, focus on the immersion, and if you get a lot of immersion from high quality sources that were created by eloquent people, then I think you'll find that you'll be able to start speaking eloquently yourself quite naturally. And also you said maybe that you don't struggle when you're writing to use bigger words, but I would say if you've been reading a lot, reading can translate into writing really naturally, and reading also translates into speaking ability as well. But in general, what you listen to tends to translate into speaking ability more than what you read. So maybe try listening to eloquent people, like I think for me in English, listening to podcasts listening to podcasts by really eloquent, smart people helps my English vocabulary and my English speaking. So I would say try to make sure you're listening to spoken forms of eloquent language. I don't know how to pronounce this name. Sorry. You've mentioned before that you only. Well, sorry. You've mentioned before benefits that you only get if you reach a very high level in the language that most language learning YouTubers aren't getting. Could you expand on what these benefits are and just how good you need to be to obtain them? So, yeah, this is kind of like, I could probably make a whole hour-long video just talking about this. It's something that is really hard to articulate in words because it's kind of inherently an experiential thing. But I think there are many different ways that I could answer this question. One is that, just for the sake of this question in particular, I'm just going to refer to the European framework. Even though it has some problems, it's a decent way to just talk about language ability in a general sort of way. So let's just say that basic fluency is a B2 level, and that's what maybe your average YouTube polyglot gets to when they say that they're fluent in a language and kind of check it off the list. And then when we're talking about getting to a very high level, we're talking about getting to like a C1 or a C2 level. So in in my experience, reflecting on my Japanese journey, when I was at around a B2 level, communicating with a native speaker took a lot of mental energy. It was not anything like communicating in English. It was like basically the difference between walking and then running, where, walking is a very relaxed thing that you can do without even thinking about it for probably hours on end, even if you don't exercise that rigorously. Whereas running is something that takes a lot of energy, and you're going to get tired out pretty quickly unless you're someone who runs all the time. And so when you're at a B2 level, communicating is like running. It's like, yeah, you can do it when you have the energy, but you get tired out really quickly, and then you have to stop. And when you don't have the energy, you just can't do it. Whereas when you're getting to like a C1 or C2 level, then it's more like your native language. So it's more effortless. And because of that, it's much easier to have meaningful interactions where you're not as worried about the language ability, and you're not as hindered by your language ability, and you can more just focus on the content of what is being discussed and communicating with the other person who you're interacting with. And so I think for me, that's a huge benefit, right? Because like when I was at a B2 level in Japanese, it was such a hassle to try to communicate with people that I wouldn't go out of my way to just sit and, have multiple hour-long conversations with friends. It was way too much work. And also there was just so many ideas that I couldn't express, and so many times where I struggled to understand what the other person was saying, and I had to have them repeat stuff or dumb stuff down, or I just didn't really get it. And so the fidelity of conversation was so much lower that it really just had less value. It was good for practical things, like if you're in the country and you need to ask for directions, or you just need to express what part of your body hurts to a doctor or something like that. You can get stuff done, but for anything that you don't have to do, it's not very fun. And so in a way, I think that's kind of unfortunate, right? If you've spent all this time learning this language, but ultimately you don't feel like you want to use it for fun because it's so much labor to use the language or do anything in the language, right? And even if you're talking about consuming content, right? When you're at a B2 level, it's like you can get the general plot of movies, but if you're like a connoisseur of movies, like you're a film buff and you're someone who is really passionate about cinema, then for you, the nuance of every little line that is spoken in a movie is probably going to take on significance to you, right? Like the dialogue, the nuances of the dialogue, is it natural or not? Or what specific decisions did the script writer make? And how well is the actor actualizing those things? That's something that, like, so much of that little nuance is going to get lost if you only have a B2 level of language ability. I mean, you can get the gist of what's being said, but again, if you're someone who's really passionate about cinema, you don't just want the gist, you want all the little nuances and particularities, and that is all missed. It's kind of like the difference between, if we use a window, like a glass window, as a metaphor for language ability, if you're at a B2 level, the window is pretty fogged up, but you can still generally see what's going on, whereas a C2 level would be like it's crystal clear. And so, like, yeah, if the thing that's on the other end of the window is something you care about, then you would think that you want to be able to see it crystal clearly, right? Without all this fog getting in the way, so you can get the gist of it, but you can't really see exactly what it is. And so if you really are passionate about any of the content of either media, books, movies, or even the content of the conversations that you have, and you want to understand that content with the highest fidelity possible without it being blurry, then you need to have that next level of language ability. And so, I mean, I think saying this amount of explanation probably will make it clear, but yeah, like, for me, I really enjoy reading Japanese, and when I'm reading Japanese, I appreciate good sentences. I appreciate when there's a sentence where I'm like, wow, this is a work of art, this sentence. Like the craftsmanship in this sentence, why he chose this particular word and he used this other word in this particular way. I appreciate that, and it enriches my experience of Japanese. It makes it inherently pleasant and fulfilling to read Japanese because I can notice all of the particularities of the craftsmanship of the authors. But I don't think I would be able to appreciate that if I was at a B2 level. I could get the gist of the meaning, I could understand the sentence, but I wouldn't be able to appreciate that craftsmanship, and because of that, the fulfillment I get out of interacting with Japanese would be significantly less. So ultimately, I think it comes down to your subjective experience in two different ways. One way meaning that if you're at a intermediate kind of, or just like basic fluency level, there's going to be so much emotional labor associated with doing anything with the language that a lot of times you're only going to want to do things in the language if you have to, or in little small bursts. You're not really going to want to live through the language. And the other thing is that you're not going to, which in a way is even more important for me, you're not going to be able to appreciate all the nuances and craftsmanship of content in the language if you don't have that highest level where you can really understand why they used this word and not that word, and exactly what the nuance of this word is. So that is my take on it. But it's not to say that there's no value in learning languages to a lower level. In fact, I'm thinking about starting a new language soon, and I don't think I want to learn it to a C2 level. I think maybe like even B1 or B2 would be enough, and I can still think of lots of benefits that I'm going to get from knowing this language to that level. And they're different than the benefits that I'm just talking about that I get from Japanese, where I can actually live my life through Japanese. I can talk with my girlfriend in Japanese and have meaningful philosophical discussions, and I can appreciate art in Japanese at a high level. So I'll talk more about the new language in the future. I'm still preparing things and things like that. So Nick asks, you've mentioned before, as well as in this video, how you've created this Matt vs. Japan persona or character and would like to do better at acting more yourself. So why don't you tell us about yourself a little? What are some of your interests or hobbies besides language learning and meditation? I think it'd be interesting to get to know you a little more, or get to know a little bit more about you for all of us. Yeah, I kind of talked a little bit about myself, or I talked a lot about myself in a couple questions ago, but that was kind of my past, So as of right now, there's kind of this new, I don't know if you call it a hobby, but there's this new area of, I don't even know what you call it, that I'm getting into. I guess you could call it personal knowledge management, which is kind of this field or also online community that revolves around just thinking about how can you make use of all the abundance of knowledge that we find around us in the most effective way possible. And alongside this idea of personal knowledge management, there's this program that I've been getting into called Roam Research, which it's not like the two are separate. There's a lot of people who are into personal knowledge management who don't use Roam. Probably most people who are into Roam are into personal knowledge management, but there's probably also some people who are into Roam and are just using it for things unrelated to personal knowledge management. But basically, well, I guess to kind of frame it from my own subjective point of view, for a while now, for even from around the middle of the time that I started learning that I was in the middle of doing all Japanese all the time, I started to kind of just come up against this problem where I could read a book that would have tons of useful information and wisdom, but then I would find that a couple months after reading the book, I had forgotten the vast majority of the details of the book. And this just felt like a big problem because it's like, I want to have all of the wisdom contained in this book kind of benefit me in some way. I want to be able to make use of it. I want to have it be part of me. Yet I just keep forgetting it. And I think especially because I was into language learning and Anki, like using Anki really made me aware of how much you forget things if you don't basically have some sort of system to help you remember them. And so it felt like, okay, Anki is a solution for remembering words in a foreign language. So there must be some sort of Anki-like solution, but just for general knowledge. And so at first I tried to just use Anki and I tried to figure out how to actually take whole books and just turn them into SRS cards. But it just wasn't really practical because, first of all, most things in a book actually aren't that valuable. It's just kind of like the nuggets of wisdom that are in the book. So if you just try to learn everything indiscriminately, you're going to be wasting a ton of time. But also it just took so much time to try to convert a book into flashcards. And then the other problem was because the flashcards were all isolated from one another and the intervals just kept getting bigger and bigger, after a while you'd run into that problem where you remember the answer to the flashcard, but you don't really remember why that flashcard is meaningful or like what the big picture takeaway of that card was. And you start to lose the connection between all the different cards. They start to just become these isolated little factoids that don't form a bigger picture. And so I gave up on trying to just memorize whole books, but I still felt like there was this issue where, I'd read a book and forget it. So it was like, well, what's even the point of reading a book if you just forget it? And then I discovered SuperMemo at some point, and SuperMemo kind of proposed a potential solution to this problem called incremental reading. And incremental reading is a really interesting idea, and it's actually something that I want to explore more, and actually I think I might be able to explore more practically with Rome. But basically the idea of it is, so SuperMemo is the first spaced repetition system to have ever been created, and the Anki actually runs on the second version of SuperMemo's algorithm, SM2. But SuperMemo has been continued to be updated since its initial creation in either the late 90s or late 80s or early 90s. Can't remember. And now the newest version of SuperMemo is SuperMemo 17, I think. And it's super advanced, and it's basically like the most user-unfriendly program that I've ever seen. It's like kind of like Photoshop, but even worse. There's a million options. It's not intuitive at all. There's menus inside of menus inside of menus inside of menus. And overall, the UI interface is just really ugly and hard to understand. And so I made a really earnest effort to try to get into SuperMemo, but ultimately just gave up because even after 6 months, it was just so clunky and hard to use that I couldn't make it work, and I went back to Anki. But anyway, there's this idea that the creator of SuperMemo came up with called incremental reading, which basically is where, let's say you want to read something like a book or an article, and you want to retain the important components of that book or article. So you import the book or article into SuperMemo, and you actually read it inside of SuperMemo. Then you highlight all the important passages that contain something you want to remember, and those passages actually become SRS cards in and of themselves. And so you read through the whole article, you highlight all the passages, and then you kind of retire that article. So now the article itself is taken out of your collection, it's archived, but now for each paragraph that you highlighted, that has its own card. And so those cards are going to come up at certain intervals, just like SRS cards, but the next time the paragraph comes up, you're going to split it up into individual sentences. And then those sentences are going to become their own cards that come up. And then when the sentences come up, then you turn them into closed cards. And so the idea is that there's this kind of smooth transition between reading a text and transforming it into cards. And the cool thing is that the process itself of translating the original text into cards is part of the spaced repetition process, because it might be a week between when you first read a paragraph and when that paragraph comes up the next time. And then it might be another 2 weeks between when the paragraph came up and then when you broke it into sentences. And then it might be 2 months before when you turn the sentence into a closed card and that card first comes up. And so it's this really efficient, streamlined system for turning text into SRS cards. And I really liked the idea in theory, but I, again, couldn't really make it work just because SuperMemo was so clunky. And there was a plugin in Anki, an add-on for Anki for incremental reading, but it was really rudimentary and just didn't really have the functionality that it would need to be effective. So I kind of just shelved the whole idea of incremental reading. It was always something that I wanted to come back to and figure out, but I didn't really know what to do with it, so I kind of shelved it. And then, and so I kept having this problem of I can read a book, it has so much wisdom, but then I can't capture that wisdom in a meaningful way. And then a couple months ago, I discovered this whole field of personal knowledge management. And the way that I kind of view it is it's kind of spearheaded by this guy called Tiago Forte, who came up with this philosophy called building a second brain. Now, he has a course for building a second brain that costs a ton of money. It's $1,500, and I haven't paid for the course, but he has a lot of free content online, and there's a lot of content made by other people around it. So you can pretty much find out everything you need without actually paying for the course if you're willing to do a little more digging work. So that's pretty much what I've been doing. I've been learning about this kind of building a second brain philosophy, which is pretty much that you create a second brain, an external sort of brain, in a note-taking app, and you store all of the insights and wisdom and knowledge that you think you might want to use in the future in the brain, in this second brain, in this external note-taking system. but you store it in such a way that you'll be able to basically resurface those insights when you need them in order to help put them together to like make bigger, like just make more connections between your ideas and then ultimately turn them into actual output, whether that's an article or a video or a book or a presentation or something like that. And so he has a whole philosophy for each step of this process. Like it starts with capture, where you have to set up a really good workflow so that when you're consuming information, whether that's an article or a book or a video or a course, that you can very effectively and easily and efficiently in a low friction way extract all the portions that you want to remember, and then kind of process them in a meaningful way, and then store them in your second brain in such a way that they will be able to resurface when they might be useful to you. And so his kind of philosophy is that if you that basically human brains are really good at connecting ideas and thinking, but they're not really good at storing information or remembering. But computers are good for that. So you want to basically create a second brain that will do the storing for you so that you can reserve your first brain for connecting and thinking. It's kind of similar to the idea of Getting Things Done by David Allen, where you're creating this external system to hold all the pieces that you need so that you can totally free up as much mental space as possible to think about things and focus on what you're doing in the moment. And of course, there's a lot more to the philosophy, but the idea is really powerful in theory, and there's a lot of people who have had a lot of success with actually implementing this. And so Tiago Forte, his go-to note-taking app, well, I should also say that he's kind of the opinion that the specific note-taking app that you use doesn't really matter, because the important things are the fundamental principles and philosophy. So you can implement the principles and the philosophy in any particular app, and certain apps might have pros and cons and things like that, but he kind of encourages people to not get too caught up in getting the perfect app, because that can be a huge time sink where you're like just spending months researching different platforms and jumping around to try one and the other and another, when in reality the most important thing is that you just pick one that's decent and stick with it and get really comfortable with it and flesh out your system in it. And so his go-to note-taking app was Evernote. And so that was pretty much the most dominant note-taking app for a long time. Another one is Microsoft OneNote, and I actually used Microsoft OneNote for a couple years. And recently there's this other program, Notion, that is getting more popular. But Rome Research is this other new program that has only been around for a year or so that is fundamentally different from all the other note-taking apps. And it's kind of hard to explain. It took me a while to really get it, but it's actually super mind-blowing once you understand the kind of way that Rome Research is structured. So basically, all the other note-taking apps, including like Notion and Evernote and Microsoft OneNote, they work as a kind of digital filing cabinet. So, for example, in Evernote, you have basically there's a single note, which is just one page, and notes belong to notebooks. So a notebook is a collection of notes, and then there's stacks of notebooks. So you can have multiple different notebooks in a stack. So there's basically this 3-tiered hierarchy where you have stacks, notebooks, and then notes. And so every note can only exist in one place. Like you can't have a note existing in two places at the same time unless you make two different copies and they're really two different notes. So every note can only exist at one place at a time, and every notebook can only exist in one stack. Just like in the physical reality, right? If you had a piece of paper, it could only exist in one folder at a time, and that folder could only exist in one drawer. But the problem with this is the way that we think is not in this kind of linear hierarchical fashion, right? And there's lots of good examples. I can't think of any right now. Like when you think about, for example, like for example, if I just take like the file system on my computer, I have a lot of trouble organizing my files because there's a lot of files that can belong in two different categories, right? So I have one folder for everything that's language learning related, and I have another folder for everything that's media related, and I have another folder for everything that is language learning media that is content creation related. So like movies that I want to watch go into the media thing, like language learning textbooks and other things like that go in the language learning thing, and then videos that I'm working on or articles go into the content creation thing. But there's a lot of overlap between the three of those, because if I have, for example, a YouTube video that I downloaded that is basically like, let's say, a Japanese video, it's like, well, that probably should go into the media folder, but it could also go into the language learning Japanese folder because it's something that I'm going to use to learn Japanese. Or when I'm doing content creation, maybe I'm writing an article about language learning and I feel like that should go in the language learning folder, but then it also should go into the content creation folder because it's something that I'm creating. So this is kind of a really bad example, and there's way better examples, but basically, the way that we think is that any one idea or concept can be associated with any number of different things, right? The night sky could be associated with darkness and sadness, but maybe also with wonder and also with space and like tons of different things. Those are also really awful examples, but there's better examples. So basically, it's this huge limitation if every single note in your note-taking system has to belong in one hierarchical place. Because first of all, when you want to start a new note, you have to think about, well, where is this going to go in my hierarchical system? And when your hierarchical system gets really complicated, after a while, you start to think, okay, I want to access this one note, and you can't remember where exactly it was, because you could think of like 5 possible places in your hierarchical system where this note that you want to find is going to be. Now, of course, you can use the search functionality, but still, everything has to be in one place. And so basically, in Roam Research, every page in the system exists on a flat hierarchy. The same flat line. There's no pages inside of pages. Every page just exists like on its own and in a kind of standalone way. And then it's so hard to explain. If you go watch a video there's a really good video by Nat Eliason called What's So Great About Roam Research that I'll put in the description. I highly recommend watching because it's way easier to see rather than just understand through an explanation. But basically, pages just link together through keywords. So if I start a new page in Roam Research and I call it language learning, and then I have a second page called Japanese. And so if on my page Japanese, I type in language learning and I put it in like double squared brackets, then that automatically creates a link to my page for language learning. And then if I click on that link and go to my page for language learning, at the bottom of the page, it's going to show me that this page was referenced in the page for Japanese. So this is what they call a backlink, where when you connect page A to page B, when you go to page B, it shows that page A is connected to it. And this kind of fundamentally flat hierarchy with this backlink system enables you to do really interesting things, where, for example, I have created a page in my Roam Research for every person in my life, and then I have a tagging system where I will tag each person people, and then whether they're a friend or acquaintance or a colleague or a family member, and then whether I know them in real life or online, and whether they know me as Matt vs. Japan or not, and like all these other things and where they live. And so now there's a really good filtering system. So if I go to my people's page, I can filter for people who are programmers and know me as Matt vs. Japan, or family members who like are immediate, or like people who are into Japanese and I know in person. And so I can find any people like this. And the other kind of thing is that there's a daily note section, which is where you can just kind of like write whatever is going on or whatever your thoughts are for a given day. And so whenever I like talk to someone, I can just put a little note of like, I just talked to so-and-so about X. And that's going to be on the daily note page for that day. And so then when I go to that person's page in the backlink section, it's going to say, oh, on so-and-so, like it's going to show that reference of, oh, it's going to say, I talked to so-and-so on this day. And so if you start just keeping like a basic journal of what you're doing, and you connect concepts and things like, and people's names and things like this, then you start to have this really kind of cool database of your whole life. And so if I want to say, hey, when was the last time I talked to Dan? I can go to Dan's page and see the last time that I talked to him, and I can like also have a good, like, also, let's just say I have an idea of, oh, next time I talk to Dan, I want to remember to tell him something like this idea. Then I can just, on the whatever day, on that current daily notes page, I can just write, like, don't forget to tell Dan X. And now when I go to Dan's page, it will also have that note there, because anytime I mention Dan's name anywhere in the entire Roam system, that's going to show up on Dan's actual page. And so basically it has this cool quality where location doesn't really matter. There's no real location in Roam. It's not that a page exists anywhere. Every page just exists nowhere and everywhere at the same time. And so you can put any information anywhere you want, and as long as you tag it with the right keywords, it will show up in all the different places that you need. And so basically, it's the perfect program for implementing the building a second brain philosophy, because basically what you can do is, like, similar to incremental reading, you can read an article and then highlight the important passages and then import those passages into Roam. And there's programs that actually let you automate this whole process, whether it's that would be a whole other thing to get into, but there's a bunch of other little side programs that integrate with Roam that can help you build a super streamlined workflow, like Readwise and Instapaper and stuff. But anyway, so you can, like, read an article, highlight the important passages, make some notes of the things you want to remember, and then import that into Roam. And then you kind of process it in Roam, where you take all the things that you think might function as keywords, and you basically just put brackets around them, which instantly turns them into a page and makes the keywords. And so if you're just reading about topics that you're interested in, and you're just saving the little bits that are interesting, and then you're putting them into Roam and you're, like, marking all the keywords, then at any certain point in time, like, let's say I want to see all my notes on habits. Well, I can go to my habit page, and then every single time I mentioned the keyword habit in any of my notes, there'll be a list at the bottom in the backlink section. And so this allows you to basically resurface ideas that you totally forgot that you even had, or just little tidbits of wisdom and things like this. And so that you can make new connections in a really cool way, where I'll connect to different articles I read about habits. One of them that I read a year ago, another one I read 6 months ago, and I didn't even remember reading either of them. But once I read the note, it refreshes my memory, and then I draw this connection. And then if I want to kind of pull those in and, like, write my own article about, like, how to create effective habits in language learning, I can easily, like, find a bunch of different cool examples and, like, references that I can pull, and then I can, because you can create your own metadata system in Roam, then when I find, like, a quote or anything I want to use, I can instantly see exactly where it's from and kind of create a bibliography really effortlessly. And so basically, I don't know if this is going to make any sense, because it's, like, pretty complicated thing to grasp without any visuals, because, it's a pretty fundamentally different thing compared to probably what all the other types of note-taking programs that you've probably heard about. But anyway, I'm just getting really excited about this whole personal knowledge management thing and the building a second brain philosophy and implementing it in Roam. And so I've been using Roam a lot, using it every day for different stuff. I'm still, like, getting the gist of the program. It's kind of a quirky program, and it's also still in development, so it has some rough edges. But I'm still far from mastering it, but so far it's been really cool, and I think this is going to totally help supercharge my content creation, because now I have a meaningful way to store all the little nuggets of wisdom that I come across when I'm just reading articles and books or watching videos, and then I'll be able to resurface them again and use them to write articles and videos and things like that. And there's also a bunch of super cool features in Roam that I didn't get to, like unlinked references, which is basically where, so I talked about how, for example, I can make habit a keyword and link it, and then when I go to the habits page, it's going to show me all the other pages in my collection that use that keyword. But there's also below that an unlinked reference section, which is going to show everywhere in my collection that just the word habit was used, regardless of whether I explicitly made it a keyword or not. And if any of those are relevant, then I can click one button and then link them and make them an actual linked reference. And also there's this visual graph where you can see a graph of how all your different pages are connected in like this like node like neural network way. And that is super cool as well. And I think you could have a lot of insights just from that, from like seeing visually how your different pages are connected. And so, yeah, I'll probably make some content about Rome in the future when I kind of master it more. But for now, yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. I've talked about it a lot in this video. But also, I'll just say that Rome is kind of expensive. It costs $15 a month. If you have a student email, or you're under the age of 21, or you're a full-time researcher, you can get half off. But I'm okay paying that because I'm getting a lot of value out of it, and I think it's really unique. And they're updating Rome all the time. It's still in development, and it's getting better and better. But there all are some free alternatives. Probably the biggest one being Obsidian. And so I have some other friends who use Obsidian because they like it more than Rome because it's free and the data is stored locally, things like that. But I've looked at Obsidian, and I think Rome is more powerful, and so I'm going with Rome. I also just kind of like the culture around Rome. There's this hashtag on Twitter called Rome Cult, and there's a really active community of people who are really passionate about Rome and knowledge management. And so I think it's really cool, and I like being a part of the whole kind of movement of Rome. And so yeah, and there's even other free versions and kind of rip-offs of Rome out there as well. But so if any of you guys are using a different version of Rome and you think it's better, you might as well not even tell me, because I don't think I'm going to switch from Rome. I'm pretty I don't know what, stubborn about it. I don't know what the right word is, but yeah. But anyway, oh yeah, and finally, so Tiago Forte's philosophy is that nothing should be memorized, but I don't really agree with this. I think that there is a place for memorization within a broader knowledge management system, because there are just certain times where knowledge is more beneficial when it's actually stored in your head. And so I think what I want to try to do, and I was actually just talking about with this guy Ramses, who actually used to run a language learning blog like back in 2012 called The Language Dojo, and I was actually a fan of this blog, and I just independently rediscovered him through Rome, because it turns out he's really active in the Rome community. And so I reached out to him, and we were talking the other day, and how basically we were kind of talking about the idea of basically implementing an incremental reading system into Rome. Now, it wouldn't 100% be in Rome, but it would be like you read an article in Instapaper, or you read a book in the Kindle app, you highlight things and make notes, and then you export that into Rome using Readwise, and then you do a second pass where you kind of link things together, and you can do some summarization work and things like that. And then maybe after that, certain things you choose to SRS. And some people actually do SRS work inside of Rome because, I mean, it's kind of clunky, but Rome has a lot of tools inside of it that allow you to do a lot of different things if you get creative. So it's actually possible to do spaced repetition inside of Rome, but I'm thinking that probably I would just use Anki alongside of Rome for this. And so again, this isn't really for language learning. This is more just for general knowledge management. But I mean, Ramses had some ideas of how you could use Rome specifically for language learning, but I still don't really see it yet. I still think that it doesn't really make that much sense, and Anki's just makes more sense for language learning. But I've already talked so much on this topic, I feel like I should probably leave it here. But anyway, now I'm kind of conflicted because I've already talked for an hour, and normally that's when I cut it off, but I've also answered a very few number of questions and spent a ton of time on something that's not even language learning related. So I'll just do 2 more questions. So Saber asks, "Hi Matt, I have a question about the new immersion roadmap. You recommend that people should focus on developing their reading skills first, followed by catching up their listening skills. Until now, I've been following your old advice of focusing on listening first. Would you recommend switching to the new roadmap and focusing on boosting my reading skills, continuing to develop listening abilities first, or finding an even split of both?" So in the new roadmap, what I recommend people to do is actually to, so stage 1 in the new roadmap is you're basically laying the foundation to be able to learn from immersion content itself. So you're basically learning the basics of the writing system, the phonetic system, the basics of the grammar, the basic vocabulary. That's stage 1. Stage 2, you're choosing, I'm actually talking to some other people in the community. I decided to change it to initial domain from home domain. So it's going to be called initial domain in the new version of the site that we're working on. But then you choose an initial domain to focus on. And at first, you're going to be watching audiovisual content with target language subtitles until you reach a strong level of comprehension in your home domain. Then you're going to start spending half your time doing pure reading and half your time doing pure listening or watching raw. And so what I would say is that if you don't have at least one domain that you can understand at a really high level with subs, then just start doing all of your active immersion with audiovisual content with subs. And this has many benefits. First of all, because watching with subs is a hybrid of reading and listening, you get to your reading abilities help your listening abilities and vice versa. So you understand as much as you understand more than you would just reading or just listening, and more comprehension means you're going to acquire faster. Also, you get to hear what's being pronounced, and so there's going to be less damage to your accent and your pronunciation than if you were just doing pure reading. And also, then you can use that same audiovisual content as passive listening and then get more listening practice in through that. And so, yeah, I would say if you can't understand at least one domain at a pretty high level with watching with target language subs, then just make that all of your immersion. After you are able to understand that first initial domain, that was redundant, that initial domain with target language subs, then I would say start spending half your time reading, half your time listening. And you probably want to maintain that 50-50 split pretty much indefinitely. That's pretty much how I think of even my Japanese, right? I want to spend some time listening and some time reading. So that is what I would say. Cole McCannon asks, how did you approach the initial anxieties of outputting with people in person? It's been going pretty well for me so far talking to Spanish-speaking coworkers, but I definitely have off days, which makes my relationship with them kind of complicated. I realize that human interaction itself is complicated and that I have off days even in English, but the fact that I've spent years cramming my brain full of hours and hours of Spanish definitely adds a bit of pressure to the situation. Thanks for all the great content, and I can't wait to see where things go from here. So, I mean, the only real advice that I can give is just do it. Because I mean, yeah, when I first started speaking Japanese to people in real life, I was nervous and I was experiencing anxiety. But I think the only way to get past that anxiety is just to push through it. And the more that you speak to native speakers, then the less anxious you get. But even for me, when I go and talk to a Japanese speaker on the street, or I talk to a Japanese waiter at a Japanese restaurant when I'm out with my friends, I'm still a little bit nervous for whatever reason, just because I don't know. Well, first of all, what if they're not Japanese? Or what if they're like fluent in English and they just answer in like a perfect American accent? I don't know. What if they're just freaked out? So part of it is more like a social anxiety rather than like a language learning related anxiety. Actually, now that I think about it, it's pretty much all that. But I mean, hey, even if you wanted to go and talk to like a random person on the road who is like a native speaker of like that natively spoke your native language, it's still nerve-wracking, right, to just go talk to a stranger, because it takes a lot of courage to do that. So I think a lot of the anxiety is actually just normal old social anxiety, and it's not really necessarily language learning anxiety. So maybe if you can Google for like general tips for social anxiety, then that would help. But even with that, I think the fundamental solution is you just got to do it. And the more that you do it, then the more you realize that even if you get embarrassed and the interaction doesn't go well, ultimately, you don't really have anything to lose. You're going to forget about it 10 minutes later, and you're never going to see that person again. And so it doesn't really matter that much. And when the interaction does go well, then it can be a really awesome experience. So, I mean, yeah, you're never going to have 100% of your interactions go well. You're always going to have awkward interactions, but that's just kind of par for the course. Now, for me in particular, I think something that helped was that most of the output that I did initially was in kind of one-off situations. Like I talked about in the past, how the first time I really outputted after becoming fluent was when I had this 2-week tour guide job where I was guiding Japanese people around my city. So in that situation, after those 2 weeks passed, then I never saw any of those people ever again. And so in a way, it didn't matter if I made a fool of myself, because even if I did, it wasn't going to be some kind of permanent stain. It was just going to end and then be over. And also, a lot of the initial interactions I had were just kind of cold approaching people that looked Japanese and trying to speak Japanese to them. And again, worst comes to worst, you have an awkward interaction, you say goodbye, you never see them again, and then half an hour later, you've forgotten it even happened. I mean, that's a little bit of exaggeration. Of course, Sometimes the really awkward ones you will remember for kind of like days and maybe even weeks after, and you'll wake up thinking about it in the middle of the night. But most of the time, that doesn't really happen. And especially once you've been doing it for a while, then the awkward interactions kind of affect you a lot less. But anyway, I practiced with those kind of one-off interactions where there was less at stake, and I think that helped. And then also, the first time that I started to have like ongoing relationships with Japanese people was when I transferred into my 4-year university when I was like 3.5 years into AJAT. And by that point, I was so fluent at Japanese that the confidence that I had in my ability basically made the anxiety not that big of an issue. And I can totally understand kind of what this person is talking about when they're like, I mean, sometimes I have good interactions, sometimes I have bad interactions, but because I'm interacting with the same people on an ongoing basis, the more awkward, lower quality interactions kind of take a big hit because I have to see those people again in the coming days and weeks. And because of that's one of the reasons why I would say that it is difficult to have ongoing relationships before you're really at a strong level of fluency. And so if you have the luxury, what I would recommend is before you get to that strong level of fluency, focus on one-off interactions or short-term interactions, and then also talking to tutors, because that's the nice thing about a tutor is that they're there to help you. And so there's no pressure or social anxiety. Like an italki tutor, I mean, like not one who's going to give you language lessons, but just one who you can pay them like $5 an hour to just have random conversations with you. Because yeah, if your language ability just isn't quite there, then you're going to have some crappy interactions, and that is really going to put a burden on your relationship if you're trying to have an actual like ongoing relationship with somebody. So that is what I'd say. So yeah, spent a lot of time talking about personal stuff this week, but I think some of you guys are interested in that because the questions came up and got a lot of upvotes. And so I guess I won't apologize for it. But anyway, yeah, hope this was useful / entertaining to you. And thanks so much for supporting, and best of luck with your studies.